Hi, this is another podcast for the Apologist bookshelf. Gary Zacharias here. I'm going to go dip way back in time, pick up a book that I don't think goes out of style at all. I haven't done a podcast on this before. It's by J.P. Moreland, and he's a terrific writer, great thinker, somebody that makes you really work, but you gain so much from reading his material. This is a book called Kingdom Triangle. And I say you have to go back a ways. It was written in 2007. It's subtitled Recover the Christian Mind, Renovate the Soul, Restore the Spirit's Power. And so J.P. Moreland gets a lot of praise for this book. I'm just going to tell you a couple of them here. Here's what Chuck Colson had to say. I profited greatly from reading Kingdom Triangle. J.P. Moreland is one of the keenest thinkers of our day. In this book, he will challenge you, and in the surprise ending, perhaps provoke you. But if so, it will lead to a very healthy discussion that's much needed within the evangelical church, a fine and thoughtful piece of work. Here's somebody else, Lee Strobel. You recognize that name, The Case for Christ. Here's a compelling call for renewing the mind, replenishing the soul, and releasing the spirit. This is vintage Moreland, passionate, practical, well-reasoned, and ultimately hopeful. It's an important book that must not be ignored. Okay, so that's good stuff. In his preface, he talks about spirituality being a big deal today, but nobody knows what form to embrace. He says, we stand at a crossroad in the American evangelical church. He said, there's never been a greater window of opportunity for us to seize the moment by our lives and by our thought to show our culture the way forward. Now, he wrote this, remember, in 2007. I think things have only gotten worse today, and he's exactly right. We've got to show our culture the way forward. We're in a dark culture these days. He said there's a growing dissatisfaction with just playing church. He said rumors of miracles are starting to trickle out of the churches. He said, I want to shed light on the crisis of our age and the way out. He said, we've got to return to Jesus and life in his kingdom. He said, I want to give you eyes to see the worldview issues that underlie the news, the entertainment industry, and the chaos and confusion all around us. Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to say. So let me go to part one. Again, I think I'm just going to walk through this like I have some other books. Some of them I've just kind of picked a chapter anywhere, but there have been some that I think need to be resolved and gone through in a logical way, starting in an opening chapter and seeing where the book goes. So I'm going to do the same here with this Kingdom Triangle. And the first part is called Assessing the Crisis of Our Age, and it's subtitled The Hunger for Drama in a Thin World. I thought that was an interesting way to put it. So here's how he starts off. He says, it doesn't really matter who you are or what you believe. JP says, you love drama. He says, you hunger for it. He says, God made you want to live a dramatic life. He said, sometimes we've watched a good movie, or we've read a great book, or we've gone to a sporting event, and we come out of it, we go back to the rest of our lives, and it's pretty drab. And here we've been experiencing on the screen or in print or whatever, this drama, this wonderful drama that just got played out. And then we go back and we feel bored with our own lives. He said we've ended up with a society we're addicted to dramatic stories and media-driven celebrities, sports. He said they're substitutes for our own authentic drama. He said we were made for greatness. But he said there's something about our culture that undermines the achievement of the greatness. He says the current addiction to the cult of celebrity and professional sports and the way we are so occupied with happiness, he says it's telling us something about our nature, but secondly, it's telling us about how bankrupt our culture is. So he says, he goes back to 1941. There was a sociologist who wrote a book called The Crisis of Our Age. And that author divided cultures into two types, sensate and ideational. He says a sensate culture is one where people only believe in the reality of the physical universe. So that would be a secular society, very worldly, empirical. Then he says there's an ideational culture. They embrace the sensory world, sure, but they go on to accept the notion that there's an immaterial reality. God, the soul, immaterial beings, values, purposes. And he says a sensate culture eventually disintegrates. because it lacks the intellectual resources to sustain a life that will help people flourish. I mean, after all, if we don't know anything about values, we don't know anything about life after death, we don't believe in a God, how can we receive solid guidance to lead a life of wisdom and character? And he said, that's what's happening in our country. He said, look around. Today, the West, that's capital W, like France and England and all, including the U.S., is sensate. It's a sensate society. He says we're actually seeing a worldview struggle, three-way worldview struggle in our society today. One is Christianity. He calls it ethical monotheism, postmodernism, and scientific naturalism. He said, I'm not going to go into all the details there, but he said he wants to say something about that third one, scientific naturalism. He said that takes the view that the physical cosmos that we look at through telescopes and microscopes, that's all there is. And it implies that everything that exists is composed of matter. There's no spiritual world. So it says that the physical science is the only way that you can gain knowledge. And then he says, because of this reaction, we've also got postmodernism coming on the scene. He says it's kind of a loose coalition. He says it's kind of difficult to characterize, but he said it's primarily reinterpreting what knowledge is. It represents a form, he says, of cultural relativism. You can't really know reality. You can't really know truth, reason. You can't know yourself. You can't know values. There's really no such thing for the postmodernist as objective reality or a meaning to life. It's just things that we have constructed. It's just creations of our language. And that's relative not to the individual. You and I don't sit down and do that by ourselves. It's part of our group culture. It's our social group. He says, under the influence of naturalism and these postmodern ideas, a lot of people today don't believe there's any ultimate meaning to life that can be known. So what do you get instead? What do you want? Well, you don't look for meaning. You just live for happiness. So the good life today is a life of happiness. And that's what you talk to your kids about. He says a major talk radio host has interviewed hundreds of people, and he's asked them, what did your parents want most for you? Success, wealth, to be a good person, or happiness? 85% said happiness. That's interesting, isn't it? And so JP says, well, happiness is a good thing, but if it's overemphasized, or if that's your focus of your life, he says that leads to depression, a loss of purpose, a sense of fragmentation. It ruins your life. Why is that? Well, for one thing, there are more important things in life than being happy. There's a bigger purpose that should be our life's aim. We're wired for more than happiness. We're in God's kingdom. We've got to learn to be spiritually competent to make that kingdom our primary concern. If happiness is what our life is all about, then what happens to things like discipline and sacrifice? Well, that goes away, doesn't it? Those are bad. So we toss them out. So he said that contemporary sense of happiness, the pleasure we get, feeling really warm and fuzzy inside, he said we can't find it by seeking it. He said, if you ever tried to be happy, you know it's true. If you spend all your time trying to be happy, what are you doing? You're focusing all your attention on yourself and how happy you are. And so you become shriveled. You're not living for a larger cause. Your life is all about you. And your moment-by-moment focus will be how you feel on the inside. So things like seeking a job, making friends, finding a spouse, getting a church, it's all coming down to, well, how does that make me feel? But he says, the best way to be happy in the contemporary sense, he says, is forget about it, to try to live a good life for a bigger purpose, especially for the cause of Christ. He says you'll end up being happier than you were if you're occupied with trying to be happy. So he looks around. He said, for the first time in history, a culture, he says ours, is filled with what psychologists are calling the empty self. That's really sad. And according to one psychologist, the empty self is filled up with consumer goods, calories, experiences, politicians, romantic partners, therapists. So there's no community there, not much tradition, not much shared meaning, not much conviction and worth. That's really sad, the empty self. I mean, go back over that list with me one more time. The empty self. Now, put yourself in there, and I start thinking about myself, filled up with consumer goods. I mean, just take that right there. the next big thing that we want to have, sitting in our home, sitting in the garage, whatever it is, consumer goods, calories. It's all about food. Experiences. We got to go to that concert. We got to go on that trip. Politicians. We hook ourselves up to a politician. Notice, by the way, we always get disappointed in our politicians. I always feel sorry for presidents. They get elected, they come into power, people are cheering them, their fans are ecstatic, and even the ones who didn't vote for them are hoping everything turns out well. And instead, what happens? They can't live up to that golden image, and in a year's time, maybe even sooner, that glow is gone. People don't like them. Romantic partners, that was part of the empty self. And notice how people are switching partners all the time, and therapists. Okay, so that's one psychologist. A professor said that when people live for happiness, they turn their attention inward and they become shriveled selves. They're not happy. And one generation, the baby boom generation, that's my generation, by the way, this professor says Americans experienced a tenfold increase in depression compared to earlier generations. Tenfold. He says that's stunning. Why is that? Well, according to this professor, this shift resulted from the fact that baby boomers stopped imitating their ancestors. Well, what'd they do? Well, those people tried to live for a cause, whether it was their country or family or God, but something bigger than they were. And instead, the baby boomers started spending all their energy on what? Themselves and their own pleasurable satisfaction. So he says they lost any sense of giving themselves daily to becoming a wise, virtuous person and living for something bigger than themselves. He says this shift from trying to focus on your character and living for a cause to being preoccupied with just pleasure brought with it, he says, a loss of character and pleasurable satisfaction. And things have gotten worse. So he says the lesson is pretty simple. Far from delivering pleasure and happiness, this strategy of living for yourself has ended up bringing discontent and depression. So he says the naturalist and the postmodern perspectives have undermined the objectivity of life and its meaning, and have brought ruin instead. So remember, he's called this the hunger for drama in a thin world. So what does he mean, thin? He said, a thin world is one with no objective value, purpose, or meaning. The world is just there. It wasn't made for some purpose. There's no life after death. There's no essence to what counts as a proper, flourishing human life. Let me share with you what he has here. He uses the atheist Bertrand Russell, who gives a nice description of a thin world. So I want you to think about this for just a minute. This is powerful. Sorry you don't have the words in front of you, because it's good to meditate and think about this. This is Bertrand Russell. He represents the people who don't think there's much beyond this world. So here we go. That man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they are achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves, and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Wow, let that sink in, huh? I mean, think about it. Let me go back for just a minute, because I think this is powerful. And you could look this up. Just look up Bertrand Russell, Russell. So first of all, we don't know why we're here, right? We didn't know where we came from. Things like our origin and all, just it's accidental. There's no heroism. You're not going to save yourself from the grave. You're going to go in the grave. That's going to be the end. And then the solar system and the entire universe is going to have heat death and be gone. What's the point? And he says, this is certain stuff. And he says, now, if you buy that truth and build your life on that, unyielding despair, then you can build your soul. Really? Unyielding despair? That's like building your hope in scaffolding in air. Oh, gosh, that's sad. It says there are three implications of a thin world. Now back to J.P. Moreland. Nothing is important enough to rise above the level of a custom, number one, right? So no big deal. No objective values in a thin world, so there's no real moral rules. There's nothing important enough to rise above the level of a custom. So that's one implication. Here's a second implication of living in a thin world. There can be no real drama. There's no meaning. So the hunger of being part of something big, it's not going to go away. So what do? We get caught up in the Super Bowl as an example. Or we live through the lives of a famous celebrity. So he says society is full of now passive people. Their greatest fear is not suffering, but boredom. He said the third thing we get into in a thin world, there's no objective difference between Mother Teresa and somebody else who's trying to be the best male prostitute he can be. Right? There's no do your own thing, basically. Who's going to judge you? Well, no one if we live in a thin world. So that's pretty sad. He says, okay, now let's consider what a thick world is all about. That's one in which there are values, objective values, not just what you feel. There is purpose. There is meaning. In a thick world, some things really do matter and some things don't. Some things have meaning and some don't. So he says, take the Muslim world for an example. If Islam is true, people live in a thick world. Islam is providing its followers with meaning and purpose and a cohesive worldview. He said, here's the problem. Islam is false, and its worldview is deeply flawed. He says, I'm not going to argue and get into that. But notice what he's saying here, and I think he's right. I think people are attracted to Islam because it gets beyond the silliness of a thin world and offers purpose and meaning. So he said, one burden of this book that he's writing is to show what happens when the Christian worldview gets replaced by naturalism and postmodernism, giving us a thin world. So he said, the problem is the centers of power in Western culture don't have resources to solve what comes out of this, which is serious spiritual and economic and political and moral problems. He said, in a thin world, religion's not the sort of thing that can be true. It's just a cultural, social phenomenon, and sociologists can examine it. He says, so if you understand it that way, then religion's like a hobby, and you shouldn't take it seriously. So then JP says he's convinced that only if naturalism and postmodernism are rejected in favor of the perspective of the kingdom God, only then can we escape the confining suffocation of a thin world and enter dramatic riches of the only thick world that's true. It's the Christian story. JP says, I want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. As he begins to wrap up the chapter, he said, we need to think about worldviews. So he said a person's worldview contains two features. First, it includes the beliefs that a person accepts about the important things, like what's reality? What is there a God? What's of value? What is knowledge? But he said a worldview is more than just a set of beliefs. These beliefs should provide a rational structure, and some are going to be very basic beliefs as part of it. He said, in general, the more central a belief is, the greater would be the change in your worldview if the belief was abandoned. I think that's a good point. So you take beliefs like, for the Christian, reality of God, the reliability of the Bible, the deity and humanity of Jesus. That's part of the Christian worldview. And he said it's important. We've got to grasp the relevant set of ideas. And then, of course, there's supporting ideas, too. Things like, for Christianity, be local church structure, spiritual gifts, and things like that. So he said, basically, when you're thinking about a worldview, it's seeing reality as depicting it in a way that makes sense to us. And so he said, let's take 5 important questions for any worldview. And then this is the heart of what he's talking about here in the book. What is real? So is this world all there is? What are the nature and limits of knowledge? What can we really know? Third, who's well off? What's the good life? I mean, just the use of the word good. What's good and true and beautiful, right? He also says, who's a really good person? How does one become a really good person? So the rest of the book, in the next couple of chapters, he looks at the worldviews of scientific naturalism and postmodernism, and then how they answered those questions. He says, it might be a little tough for you, but we need to know. And then he's moving on to Christianity. So that's his first chapter. I hope you see how powerful it is and how much it makes you think about the way we spend our life and what's important to us. Well, thank you for being part of this. We'll do some more of J.P. Moreland's book and some of his other books. They're all good. Thank you for being part of the podcast. Talk to you later.